The water was ankle-deep and rising when Marcus Brennan first descended into what his deceased uncle had euphemistically called the basement. The concrete steps were slick with decades of moisture, and the air smelled of mold, rust, and something else, something metallic and ancient that made his stomach turn. Above him, through the warped wooden door, he could hear his in-laws' voices carrying down from the kitchen. "Poor Sarah," his mother-in-law Margaret was saying, her voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. "Married to a man whose own family thought so little of him, they left him a flooded hole in the ground." Marcus gripped the flashlight tighter, its beam cutting through the murky darkness below. He'd driven 8 hours from Chicago to this godforsaken corner of rural Wisconsin to inspect the property his Uncle Heinrich had left him, the uncle he'd met exactly twice in his 34 years of life. The same uncle who'd apparently been the family embarrassment, the one nobody talked about except in whispers about his strange obsessions and unhealthy interest in the war. "Honestly," Margaret continued above, "what kind of inheritance is this? A house that's falling apart and a basement that floods every spring?" Heinrich must have been senile or cruel. Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd heard enough of Margaret's opinions about his family's modest means over the 5 years he'd been married to Sarah. Every family gathering became a subtle interrogation about his job as a community college history professor, complete with pointed questions about when he might find something more substantial or live up to his potential. The fact that he'd inherited anything at all seemed to offend her sensibilities. "Maybe Marcus can turn it into a swimming pool," his brother-in-law Derek called out, followed by the sound of beer bottles clinking together. Though, knowing him, he'd probably fill it with old books instead of water. The laughter that followed made Marcus's face burn with embarrassment and anger. He'd driven here straight from teaching his afternoon seminar on World War II European history, still wearing his only good suit, the one Sarah had bought him for their wedding. Now the pants were soaked to the knees, and his dress shoes squelched with each step downward. But something about this basement didn't feel right. The flooding was recent, that much was obvious from the way the water lapped against the lower steps. But the basement itself... Marcus played his flashlight along the walls, frowning. These weren't typical poured concrete foundations. The walls were thick, reinforced, with what looked like steel rebars running through them at regular intervals. The craftsmanship was unusual for a simple farmhouse basement, almost military in its precision. "Marcus!" Sarah's voice called down. "Come up here! Mom wants to discuss what we should do with this place." Marcus knew what that meant. Margaret had already decided they should sell the property immediately, probably to one of her real estate developer friends who would pay a fraction of its worth. The conversation would be less discussion and more lecture about cutting their losses and moving on. "Just a minute," he called back, taking another step down into the murky water. The basement was larger than it should have been, much larger. His flashlight beam couldn't reach the far walls, which made no sense given the modest size of the farmhouse above. Marcus waded forward, the cold water soaking through his socks, his historian's instinct screaming that something was very wrong here, or very right, depending on how you looked at it. That's when his foot hit something solid beneath the water, not the concrete floor he'd expected, but something metal, something that shouldn't be there. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I want to take a moment to thank you for watching. Creating and narrating these detailed, novel-length stories takes tremendous time and research to bring you the most engaging content possible. We're embarking on a journey of nearly 50,000 words together. That's a full novella. If you're already hooked by what you've heard, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this story with someone who would enjoy it, and subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest stories. This is going to be an epic adventure, so get comfortable, and let's continue with this remarkable tale. Marcus knelt in the murky water, his expensive suit pants now completely ruined, and felt along the submerged object with his hands. It was definitely metal, steel by the feel of it, and perfectly smooth except for what felt like rivets along its edges. A handle. There was a handle. "What the hell?" he muttered, trying to get a grip on the metal ring. It was heavy, far heavier than any normal basement fixture should be. As he pulled, the water around him swirled with disturbed sediment, and suddenly the handle gave way with a grinding screech that echoed through the basement like a wounded animal. The sound was followed immediately by a different noise, the gurgling rush of water draining away. Marcus stumbled backward as the flood that had plagued this basement for who knows how many years suddenly began disappearing down what was apparently a very sophisticated drainage system. "Marcus, what was that noise?" Sarah's voice carried down from above, tinged with worry. "Nothing, just checking something out," he called back, watching in amazement as the water level dropped rapidly. Within minutes, the concrete floor was visible, though still slick, with decades of accumulated grime and moisture. But it wasn't just a concrete floor. As the water receded, Marcus could see that what he'd pulled was indeed a handle, attached to a massive steel hatch set flush into the ground. The hatch was easily 6 feet across, with German text etched around its perimeter that his rusty language skills could just barely make out. Achtung, Autorisiert, personal nur. Authorized personnel only. Marcus's heart began to race. His academic specialty was World War II history, with a particular focus on Nazi Germany's domestic operations. He'd written his dissertation on the German-American Bund and its activities in the United States during the 1930s and early 1940s. He knew that Wisconsin, with its large German-American population, had been a particular hotbed of Nazi sympathizer activity before America entered the war. But this was impossible, wasn't it? The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs above made him look up. Sarah was descending carefully, holding her phone's flashlight out in front of her. "The water's gone," she said, sounding amazed. "How did you—" She stopped mid-sentence as her light fell on the steel hatch. "Marcus, what is that?" Sarah Brennan had inherited her mother's practical nature, but thankfully, not her cruel tongue. At 32, she was a successful pediatric nurse who approached problems with calm efficiency. She'd fallen in love with Marcus during their undergraduate years at UW-Madison, drawn to his passion for history and his gentle nature. But even she had her limits when it came to his tendency to get obsessed with historical mysteries. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "your Uncle Heinrich left us a lot more than a flooded basement." "My Uncle Heinrich?" Sarah's voice rose an octave. "Marcus, Heinrich was your uncle, your father's brother." Marcus paused, his hand still on the metal handle. Sarah was right, of course. Heinrich Brennan had been his father's older brother, the one who'd emigrated from Germany in the late 1930s and settled in this remote corner of Wisconsin. The family had always been vague about Heinrich's past, describing him only as a man who'd, quote, wanted to start fresh in America and who'd become increasingly reclusive as he aged. "Right, sorry," Marcus said, though his mind was racing. "I'm just trying to process this." Sarah stepped closer, her nurse's training making her careful of the slippery floor. "What exactly is this, Marcus? Because that looks like military equipment, and I'm not sure I want to know why your uncle had military equipment hidden under his basement." Before Marcus could answer, Margaret's voice boomed down from above. "Sarah, what are you two doing down there? Derek says we should call a contractor about the flooding and get this place condemned. The sooner we're done with this mess, the better." Sarah looked at Marcus, and he could see the conflict in her eyes. Part of her wanted to go upstairs, agree with her mother, and put this strange inheritance behind them. But another part, the part that had fallen in love with a history professor who could spend hours discussing obscure details of past events, was clearly intrigued. "Don't say anything yet," Marcus whispered, "not until we know what we're dealing with." Sarah bit her lip, a habit she'd had since childhood when faced with difficult decisions. "Marcus, if this is what I think it might be, what do you think it might be? I think my husband's family has some secrets that might be better left buried." The weight of her words settled between them like a physical presence. Marcus knew she was probably right. Whatever lay beneath this hatch had been hidden for decades, possibly since before either of them was born. Heinrich had died at 93, which meant he would have been in his 20s during World War II. The timeline was uncomfortable, to say the least. But Marcus was a historian. The idea of walking away from what could be the discovery of a lifetime was physically painful to him. And there was something else. Something he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. A feeling that his Uncle Heinrich had left this for him specifically, that there was more to the story than a simple inheritance of property. "Sarah! Marcus!" Derek's voice joined the chorus from above. Mom says if you don't come up in the next 5 minutes, she's calling the sheriff to make sure you haven't fallen through the floor or something. Sarah looked at her husband, recognizing the expression on his face. It was the same look he got when he was researching a particularly fascinating historical puzzle. The same intensity that had first attracted her to him in their college library all those years ago. 5 minutes, she said firmly. We look at whatever's down there for 5 minutes, and then we go upstairs and figure out what to do like adults. Marcus nodded eagerly and began working at the mechanisms around the hatch's edge. There were multiple locking points, each requiring a specific sequence to disengage. The engineering was sophisticated, far beyond what any farmer or typical homeowner would need for a simple storage area. As the final lock clicked open, Marcus felt a rush of stale air from below, air that had been sealed away for decades. The smell that came up was different from the moldy basement odor above. This air smelled of metal, paper, and something else. Something that reminded him of the archives at the university, but older, much older. Marcus, Sarah said quietly, I have a really bad feeling about this. Marcus lifted the heavy hatch, his muscles straining against its weight. Below them, a ladder descended into perfect darkness. But even in the dim light from their phones, they could see that the space below was substantial. This wasn't a simple hidey hole or storm shelter. The walls were lined with what appeared to be metal shelving, and Marcus could make out the edges of boxes, filing cabinets, and other objects carefully arranged in the hidden chamber. It's like a bunker, Sarah whispered. Not like a bunker, Marcus corrected, his voice filled with awe. It is a bunker. And from the look of this construction, it was built to last. Above them, the sound of heavy footsteps announced Derek's arrival at the top of the basement stairs. Hey, Mom's getting worried. What's taking so long down there? Marcus looked at his wife, seeing his own mixture of excitement and terror reflected in her eyes. Whatever lay below them represented a significant piece of history, possibly one that could change everything they thought they knew about his family, but it also represented the kind of dangerous knowledge that could destroy relationships, careers, and lives. Coming! Sarah called up to her brother. Then, more quietly to Marcus, we need to cover this up and think about what we're doing. Marcus nodded reluctantly, though every fiber of his being wanted to climb down that ladder immediately. Together, they wrestled the heavy hatch back into place, the mechanisms clicking shut with the same precision they'd shown when opening. Within moments, it looked like nothing more than an unusually smooth section of basement floor. But as they climbed the stairs back to the kitchen, Marcus's mind was racing. The construction of the bunker, the German text, the timeline of his uncle's immigration, everything pointed to connections that his family had apparently kept hidden for more than 80 years. In the kitchen, Margaret was holding court at the small dinette table, Derek beside her with a fresh beer, both of them looking like they'd already made all the important decisions about the property's future. There you are, Margaret said with obvious relief. Derek and I have been discussing the situation, and we think the best course of action is to contact my friend Janet. She's in real estate, and see if we can sell this place as is to someone who doesn't mind dealing with water damage. Market's good right now for fixer-uppers, and frankly, this place is too much work for you two to handle. Sarah sat down across from her mother, still processing what they'd just discovered. Mom, maybe we should take some time to... Time is money, sweetheart, Margaret interrupted. The longer you hold on to a property like this, the more it's going to cost you in taxes and maintenance. Trust me, I've seen too many young couples get in over their heads trying to fix up family properties that should have been sold immediately. Marcus remained standing by the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the property's overgrown yard. The farmhouse sat on nearly 20 acres of mostly wooded land, isolated enough that the nearest neighbor was more than a mile away. Perfect privacy for someone who wanted to keep secrets. What do you know about Uncle Heinrich? Marcus asked suddenly, turning to face the room. Derek snorted. The crazy hermit? Not much to know, from what Dad told us. Came over from Germany sometime before the war, bought this place, and basically became a recluse. Never married, never had kids, spent most of his time doing whatever weird stuff hermits do. He wasn't crazy, Sarah said quietly. I met him a few times when we were first dating. He seemed intense, maybe, very serious, but not crazy. Margaret waved dismissively. The man lived alone in the middle of nowhere for 70 years, Sarah. That's not normal behavior. And from what I heard, he had some very strange ideas about, well, about a lot of things. Strange how? Marcus pressed. Oh, you know, Margaret said, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. My mother used to say he had pictures of people he shouldn't have had pictures of, if you know what I mean. And books. Lots of books in German that probably weren't appropriate. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. What kind of inappropriate books? Marcus, Derek interjected. Why does it matter? The guy's dead, the house is falling apart, and you've got a basement that floods every spring. Just take Mom's advice and sell the place. But Marcus was remembering something his own father had mentioned years ago, during one of the rare occasions when Heinrich's name had come up in family conversation. Something about Heinrich having been involved in politics back in Germany, and how coming to America had been the best thing for everyone involved. At the time, Marcus had assumed his father meant Heinrich had fled some kind of political persecution. But now, with the evidence of the bunker fresh in his mind, he was beginning to wonder if the reality had been quite different. I think we should stay here tonight, Marcus announced suddenly. The room fell silent. Margaret's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, settling on barely contained outrage. Derek looked like Marcus had just suggested they burn the house down. Even Sarah stared at her husband in surprise. Stay here? Margaret finally sputtered. Marcus, there's no heat, no proper plumbing, and the basement floods. Why on earth would you want to stay in this dump? Because it's mine now, Marcus said, surprised by the firmness in his own voice. Because I want to understand what Uncle Heinrich left me before I make any decisions about selling it. What's to understand? Derek demanded. It's a broken-down house on worthless land. You're a history teacher, not a contractor. You can't fix this place up. Maybe I don't want to fix it up, Marcus replied. Maybe I want to understand its history first. Margaret stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Sarah, talk sense into your husband. This is exactly the kind of impractical thinking that's held him back professionally. He gets these obsessions about historical nonsense and loses sight of practical realities. Sarah looked between her mother and her husband, clearly torn. Marcus could see the conflict playing out across her face, her ingrained habit of deferring to her mother's judgment warring with her loyalty to him and her own growing curiosity about what they'd found. Maybe, Sarah said slowly, it wouldn't hurt to spend one night here, just to get a feel for the place. Margaret's mouth dropped open. Sarah Elizabeth Brennan, you cannot be serious. This place isn't safe, it's not clean, and it's certainly not appropriate for a woman in your condition. Marcus felt the world tilt sideways. What condition? Sarah's face flushed bright red. She looked at her mother with an expression of pure fury that Marcus had never seen before. Mom, Sarah said, her voice dangerously quiet. I told you that was private. Private? Margaret looked genuinely confused. Sweetheart, it's wonderful news. There's no reason to keep it secret. What condition? Marcus repeated, looking between the two women. Derek, apparently sensing the brewing storm, quietly opened another beer and took a long drink. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, then looked directly at her husband. I was going to tell you tonight. I found out yesterday. I'm pregnant, Marcus. We're going to have a baby. The kitchen fell completely silent, except for the ticking of an old clock on the wall and the distant sound of wind through the trees outside. Marcus felt like he'd been hit by lightning, pure shock followed by an overwhelming rush of joy and terror in equal measure. Pregnant, he repeated numbly. 8 weeks, Sarah confirmed, tears starting to form in her eyes. I wanted to tell you in private, somewhere special, not like this. Marcus crossed the kitchen in 3 quick steps and pulled his wife into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around once before setting her down gently. We're having a baby, he said, grinning so widely his face hurt. We're having a baby, Sarah confirmed, laughing and crying at the same time. Margaret cleared her throat loudly, which is exactly why you two need to be practical about this inheritance situation. You can't afford to waste money on a property like this when you have a child coming. You need to sell this place immediately and put the money toward a proper house in a good school district. The mention of money brought Marcus crashing back to reality. Margaret was right about their financial situation. His professor's salary was modest at best, and while Sarah made decent money as a nurse, they'd been saving for years just to afford a down payment on a small house in Chicago. The unexpected inheritance had seemed like a possible answer to their prayers, But a flooded basement and a crumbling farmhouse weren't going to solve their problems. Except, what if the bunker contained something valuable? What if Uncle Heinrich had left more than just property? Marcus looked at his wife, trying to communicate with his eyes what he couldn't say aloud. Sarah, perhaps reading his expression or perhaps driven by her own curiosity, nodded almost imperceptibly. "One night," she said firmly to her mother, "we're going to stay here one night, look through Uncle Heinrich's papers, and figure out what we're dealing with. Then we'll make a decision about selling." Margaret threw up her hands in exasperation. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when you realize you've wasted time and money on this foolishness. Derek, we're leaving. Maybe a night in this place will bring them to their senses." As Margaret gathered her purse and jacket, muttering under her breath about impractical dreamers and poor decision-making, Marcus caught Derek by the arm. "Derek, don't say anything to anyone about us staying here, okay? I mean, don't mention it to your friends or post about it online or anything." Derek looked puzzled. "Why would I post about you staying in a dump? Just humor me, okay?" Derek shrugged. "Whatever, man, your funeral." He paused at the kitchen door. "Seriously, though, congratulations about the baby. That's really great news." After Margaret and Derek left, the farmhouse felt almost oppressively quiet. Marcus and Sarah stood in the kitchen, suddenly alone with the weight of everything that had happened in the past few hours. "So," Sarah said finally, "we're having a baby." "We're having a baby," Marcus agreed, pulling her close again. "And we might have found a Nazi bunker in your uncle's basement." "We might have found a Nazi bunker in my uncle's basement." Sarah laughed, but it had a slightly hysterical edge. "Marcus, what are we doing? This is crazy. My mother's right. We should sell this place and use the money for practical things. For our baby." Marcus held her at arm's length, looking into her eyes. "Sarah, what if there's something down there that's worth more than the property itself? What if Uncle Heinrich left us something that could change our lives? Or what if he left us something that could destroy our lives?" Sarah countered. "Marcus, you know as well as I do what that bunker probably contains. Documents, artifacts, maybe even worse things. Things that could implicate your family in activities that people went to prison for after the war." Marcus knew she was right. The rational thing to do would be to seal the bunker permanently and sell the property to someone who would never discover its secrets. But the historian in him couldn't let go of the possibility that they'd stumbled onto something significant, something that could provide new insights into a dark period of American history. "One night," he said, echoing Sarah's earlier words, "we spend tonight going through whatever's down there. If it's incriminating evidence of war crimes, we figure out how to handle it responsibly. If it's valuable historical artifacts, we figure out how to authenticate and possibly sell them. And if it's just a crazy old man's collection of junk, we seal it up and never speak of it again." Sarah studied her husband's face for a long moment. She'd known when she married him that his passion for history sometimes overrode his practical judgment. It was one of the things she loved about him, but it was also one of the things that worried her. "Promise me something," she said finally. "Anything. Promise me that if we find anything down there that could hurt us or our baby, we walk away. No matter how historically significant it might be. Promise me that our family comes first." Marcus nodded solemnly. "I promise, our family comes first." As the sun set over the Wisconsin countryside, casting long shadows through the farmhouse windows, Marcus and Sarah Brennan prepared to descend into their inheritance and confront whatever secrets Heinrich Brennan had been keeping for more than 70 years. Neither of them could have imagined that by morning they would be millionaires, or that by the end of the week they would be running for their lives. The farmhouse had no electricity, but Marcus found a collection of battery-powered camping lanterns in what appeared to be Heinrich's bedroom closet, along with several heavy-duty flashlights and enough batteries to power a small electronics store. Everything was carefully organized and maintained, suggesting that Heinrich had been prepared for extended periods without public utilities. "Your uncle was quite the prepper," Sarah observed, testing one of the lanterns. The LED bulb cast a bright, steady light that would be perfect for exploring the bunker. "Or he was paranoid about something," Marcus replied, loading fresh batteries into two of the larger flashlights. "The question is whether his paranoia was justified." They'd spent the early evening making the farmhouse habitable for one night. The water still worked, though it came out brown for the first few minutes from each tap. The kitchen stove was propane-powered and functional, allowing Sarah to heat some canned soup they'd found in Heinrich's well-stocked pantry. The bedroom where they'd be sleeping was dusty but clean, with a bed that looked like it had barely been used. Everything about the house suggested that Heinrich had lived simply, but with careful preparation. The pantry contained enough non-perishable food to last months. The closets held multiple sets of practical clothing in various sizes. And everywhere they looked, they found evidence of a man who had expected trouble and planned accordingly. "Marcus," Sarah said as they prepared to return to the basement, "what if this isn't just about World War II history? What if your uncle was involved in something more recent?" It was a possibility that had been nagging at Marcus as well. Heinrich had lived until just 6 months ago, dying peacefully in his sleep at age 93. If he'd been hiding evidence of wartime activities, why hadn't he destroyed it decades ago? Why preserve it unless it still had value or purpose? "Only one way to find out," Marcus said, clipping a flashlight to his belt and picking up 2 of the camping lanterns. The basement was still dry, the mysterious drainage system apparently working perfectly. In the bright LED light, the steel hatch looked even more impressive, clearly military-grade construction that would have been expensive and difficult to install, especially in the 1940s or 1950s. "Last chance to change your minds," Sarah said as Marcus began working the locking mechanisms. "Sarah, we're having a baby. We need to know what we're dealing with." The hatch opened with the same grinding screech as before, and the ladder disappeared down into darkness. Marcus descended first, his flashlight beam revealing a space that was far more extensive than either of them had imagined. The bunker was enormous, easily the size of a large basement, with multiple rooms branching off from a central area. The construction was professional grade, reinforced concrete walls, ventilation systems, and what appeared to be a sophisticated air filtration setup. This wasn't something a single person could have built in secret. This was the work of professionals, possibly military engineers. "Jesus Christ," Sarah whispered as she reached the bottom of the ladder. Her voice echoed slightly in the space, suggesting the bunker extended even further than they could see. Marcus played his light along the walls, revealing metal shelving units filled with carefully labeled boxes, filing cabinets that looked like they'd been built to withstand bombing, and what appeared to be a complete communications setup, including radio equipment that looked decades out of date but meticulously maintained. "Yours." Heinrich wasn't just hiding documents, Marcus said, his voice filled with awe. He was running some kind of operation down here. They moved deeper into the bunker, their lights revealing room after room of carefully organized materials. One room contained what appeared to be a complete photographic darkroom, with chemicals still properly stored and equipment that looked like it had been used recently. Another room was set up as a workshop, with tools for everything from electronics repair to document forgery. But it was the third room that made them both stop in their tracks. The walls were covered with maps, not just of Wisconsin or the United States, but detailed topographical maps of locations around the world. Pins and string connected various points, creating a web of connections that spanned continents. And in the center of it all was a large desk, covered with documents in multiple languages, photographs of people they didn't recognize, and what appeared to be financial records dating back decades. "Sarah," Marcus said quietly, "I don't think Heinrich was hiding evidence of past crimes. I think he was actively involved in something." Sarah moved to examine one of the walls more closely. Among the maps and photographs were newspaper clippings dating from the 1940s through what appeared to be just a few months ago. The stories covered a wide range of topics: war crimes trials, unexplained deaths of elderly men in various countries, discoveries of hidden artwork, and several articles about efforts to track down Nazi war criminals who had fled to South America. "Marcus, look at this," Sarah called, pointing to a particular section of clippings. "These are all about Nazi hunters, people who spent their lives tracking down war criminals." Marcus joined her, studying the articles. Many of them featured the same few names: historians, investigators, and government agents who had dedicated themselves to finding justice for wartime atrocities. Several of the articles had been marked with red ink, with notes in the margins written in what appeared to be Heinrich's handwriting. He was tracking the trackers, Marcus realized. But why? The answer came from an unexpected source. Sarah had moved to examine a filing cabinet and discovered that it was unlocked. The top drawer contained dozens of manila folders, each labeled with a name and dates. She pulled out one at random and opened it, revealing a complete dossier on a man named Simon Wiesenthal, the famous Nazi hunter who had brought numerous war criminals to justice. But this wasn't the kind of information you'd find in a library or newspaper archive. This file contained personal details, photographs of Wiesenthal's home and family, travel schedules, and what appeared to be surveillance reports dating back to the 1960s. "Marcus," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "your uncle wasn't hiding from Nazi hunters. He was hunting them." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the implications hit him. If Heinrich had been surveilling Nazi hunters for decades, it meant he wasn't just a war criminal in hiding. He was actively working to protect other war criminals. The bunker wasn't a hiding place. It was a command center. But then Sarah opened another file, and everything they thought they understood changed again. The file was labeled Operation Safeguard and contained documents that appeared to be U.S. government communications. Official letterhead, classification stamps, and signatures that looked legitimate. As Marcus read through the materials, his hands began to shake. "Sarah, these documents, they're saying that Heinrich was working for the U.S. government. Something called Operation Paperclip, and then later operations that continued through the Cold War." Operation Paperclip was something Marcus knew about from his academic research, the secret U.S. program that had brought Nazi scientists to America after World War II to help with rocket development and other military projects. But according to these documents, the operation had been much larger and had continued much longer than the official histories indicated. Heinrich hadn't been hiding from justice. He'd been provided protection by the U.S. government in exchange for his cooperation in tracking down other Nazi war criminals and recovering stolen assets. The surveillance files on Nazi hunters weren't for the purpose of harming them. They were intelligence reports designed to help their efforts while keeping Heinrich's involvement secret. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a document dated just 3 years earlier. "It's a payment voucher from something called the Historical Recovery Initiative. They were paying him a salary." Marcus studied the document. It was signed by someone at the Department of Justice and authorized a monthly payment of $15,000 to Heinrich Brennan for consultation services related to asset recovery and historical documentation. "$15,000 a month?" Sarah said incredulously. "For 3 years. Marcus, your uncle was making more money than both of us combined." But the financial revelations were just the beginning. As they continued searching through the files, they discovered evidence of recovered artwork, precious metals, and other valuables that Heinrich could help locate and return to their rightful owners or to museums. Each successful recovery had earned him substantial finder's fees from various governments and organizations. And then Marcus found the file that changed everything. It was labeled simply Final Project and contained documentation of what appeared to be Heinrich's last major discovery, something he'd been working on for more than 5 years before his death. According to his notes, he'd been tracking a particular group of Nazi officials who had escaped to South America with an enormous cache of stolen gold, artwork, and other valuables. The trail had led him to a series of Swiss bank accounts, safety deposit boxes in 3 different countries, and ultimately to a discovery that had apparently shocked even Heinrich, the location of what he called the Berlin Reserve, a massive cache of gold and other valuables that had been hidden by high-ranking Nazi officials as insurance against Germany's defeat. The final entry in the file was dated just 2 weeks before Heinrich's death. It was a single sentence, written in shaky handwriting, location confirmed. Value estimated $180 million. MB, to receive all necessary information upon my death. MB Marcus Brennan. Sarah sank into the chair behind Heinrich's desk, staring at her husband in disbelief. "Marcus, are you telling me that your uncle left you information about where to find $180 million in stolen Nazi gold?" Marcus was flipping through the rest of the file, finding detailed maps, bank account numbers, contact information for various government agencies, and what appeared to be a complete legal framework for claiming the recovered assets. "It's not stolen," Marcus said, his voice filled with amazement. "According to these documents, it's legitimate recovery. Heinrich spent decades working with international law enforcement to track down and recover assets stolen by the Nazis. This final cache represents the end of his life's work, and he's left it to us." "To us?" Marcus showed Sarah the legal documents Heinrich had prepared. Everything was official and above board, with proper documentation establishing Marcus as Heinrich's legal heir and recipient of any assets recovered through his work with various government agencies. Sarah, we're not just inheriting a house, we're inheriting the culmination of a 70-year investigation into one of the largest treasure recoveries in history. Sarah stood up slowly, her mind reeling from the implications. Marcus, this is insane. People don't just inherit $180 million. There have to be conditions, complications, other people involved. She was right, of course. As they continued reading through Heinrich's files, they discovered that the recovery operation would require them to work with agents from multiple countries, navigate complex international law, and potentially put themselves in considerable danger. The people who had originally hidden the Berlin Reserve had killed to protect their secret, and some of their descendants might be equally motivated to keep it hidden. But the potential reward was staggering. Not just the money, but the historical significance of recovering and properly documenting one of the largest caches of Nazi-looted assets ever discovered. For Marcus, it represented the discovery of a lifetime. For Sarah, it represented financial security for their growing family that she'd never dared to dream of. "What do we do?" Sarah asked. Marcus looked around the bunker, taking in the evidence of his uncle's decades-long dedication to justice and historical recovery. Heinrich had spent his entire adult life working to right the wrongs of history, and he'd chosen Marcus to continue that work. "We call the number Heinrich left for us," Marcus said, holding up a card with contact information for Agent Rebecca Martinez at the Department of Justice. According to his notes, she's been his primary contact for the past 10 years. Sarah looked at the card skeptically. "Marcus, it's 11 o'clock at night. We can't just call a federal agent and say, 'Hi, we found a secret bunker and think we've inherited $180 million in Nazi gold.'" "The card says 24-hour contact," Marcus pointed out. "And according to Heinrich's files, Agent Martinez has been expecting this call. She knows about the final project." Before Sarah could object further, Marcus had pulled out his cell phone and dialed the number. After 3 rings, a professional female voice answered. "Martinez." "Agent Martinez? This is Marcus Brennan, Heinrich Brennan's nephew. I think you've been expecting my call." There was a brief pause then. "Mr. Brennan, yes, I've been waiting to hear from you. Are you at the property?" "Yes, we're here. We found the bunker." "Good. Is anyone else with you?" Marcus glanced at Sarah. "My wife." "Anyone else know about your discovery?" "No, just us." "Keep it that way for now. Mr. Brennan, I need you to listen carefully. Your uncle's final project involves some very dangerous people who would kill to keep their secrets buried. The fact that you've made contact with me means they may already know the timeline has accelerated." Marcus felt his stomach drop. What timeline? Heinrich had been under surveillance by hostile parties for several months before his death. "We believe his passing was natural, but we can't be certain. If you've accessed his files, you need federal protection immediately." Sarah had moved close enough to hear both sides of the conversation, and Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. This was exactly what she'd been worried about. "Agent Martinez," Sarah said, leaning toward the phone, "we have a baby on the way. We don't want any part of dangerous situations. Maybe we should just walk away from all of this." "Mrs. Brennan, I understand your concerns, but walking away isn't an option anymore. The moment you opened that bunker, you became part of this operation. The people we're dealing with don't leave loose ends." Marcus and Sarah looked at each other, the weight of their situation beginning to sink in. They weren't just treasure hunters who'd stumbled onto a lucky discovery. They were now participants in an ongoing federal investigation involving international criminals who had been killing people to protect their secrets for decades. "What do we do?" Marcus asked. "Stay exactly where you are, don't leave the property, don't contact anyone else, and don't discuss this with family or friends. I'm dispatching a team to your location now. They'll be there by dawn." "A team?" "Protection and technical support. Mr. Brennan, your uncle spent the last 5 years of his life setting up an operation to recover the Berlin Reserve. You're now the key to that operation's success, which makes you the most important witness in a case that spans 7 decades and involves some very powerful people who thought their secrets died with Heinrich." After Agent Martinez hung up, Marcus and Sarah sat in the bunker's main room, surrounded by the evidence of Heinrich's secret life, trying to process what they'd gotten themselves into. "We should have listened to my mother," Sarah said quietly. "Your mother wanted us to sell the property immediately. We would have sold it to some developer who would have found the bunker eventually. At least this way we have some control over the situation." "Control?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Marcus, we just learned that there are people who might kill us to protect Nazi secrets, and you think we have control?" Marcus moved to examine more of Heinrich's files, looking for additional information about the dangers they might be facing. What he found wasn't reassuring. Heinrich had documented several attempts on his life over the years, including a suspicious car accident in 1987, a break-in at his property in 1995 that had been designed to look like random vandalism, and as recently as 2018, an attempt to poison him that he'd only survived because of his paranoid habit of testing his food. The people protecting the Berlin Reserve weren't just motivated by greed. According to Heinrich's research, the cache contained not just gold and artwork, but also documents that could implicate dozens of prominent families and institutions in Nazi collaboration. People whose reputations, fortunes, and family legacies depended on keeping those secrets buried. "Sarah, look at this," Marcus said, showing her a file labeled Active Threats. It contained photographs and information about several individuals who Heinrich believed were actively working to prevent the recovery of the Berlin Reserve. The list included a Swiss banker whose family had helped launder Nazi gold, a prominent art dealer whose gallery had been built on stolen masterpieces, and most disturbingly, a retired U.S. State Department official whose father had been a high-ranking Nazi who'd escaped to Argentina after the war. "These people have been living normal lives for decades," Marcus said, "respected members of society with everything to lose if the truth comes out." Sarah studied the photographs, recognizing a few faces from news articles and society pages. "Marcus, these aren't random criminals. These are people with resources, connections, and the ability to make problems disappear." "Which is why we need federal protection," Marcus replied. "And why Heinrich set up this operation with the Department of Justice, instead of trying to handle it alone." They spent the next few hours reading through more of Heinrich's files, trying to understand the full scope of what they'd inherited. The Berlin Reserve had been assembled by a group of Nazi officials in the final months of World War II, representing not just their personal wealth but also valuables stolen from Holocaust victims, conquered territories, and national treasuries across Europe. Heinrich's investigation had tracked the reserve through a complex network of Swiss banks, Argentinian estates, and ultimately to its current location, a series of underground vaults in the mountains of Chile, protected by a group of families whose patriarchs had been Nazi war criminals. The Chilean government had been cooperating with the recovery effort for several years, but the operation required someone with legal standing to claim the assets, someone who could prove their connection to Heinrich's investigation and their authority to act on behalf of the various governments and organizations seeking restitution. That someone was Marcus. According to these documents, Marcus said, "Heinrich spent 5 years establishing the legal framework for me to claim the reserve. He's documented my genealogy, my academic credentials, and my moral character. He's essentially made me the legally designated heir to his life's work." "But why you?" Sarah asked. "Why not work directly with the government? Why involve us at all?" Marcus found the answer in Heinrich's personal notes, written in a mixture of English and German that revealed more about his uncle's psychology than any official document could. Heinrich had never married or had children, dedicating his entire life to making amends for Germany's crimes and his own family's complicated history. But in his final years, he'd become concerned that government agencies were more interested in recovering assets than in ensuring proper justice for victims and their families. By leaving the operation to Marcus, a history professor with academic integrity and no political connections, Heinrich hoped to ensure that the recovery would be handled with the respect and transparency that the victims deserved. He wanted someone who would care more about doing the right thing than about personal gain, Marcus realized. Someone who would make sure the recovered assets went to the right people instead of disappearing into government coffers. Sarah leaned back in Heinrich's chair, exhausted by the emotional weight of everything they'd learned. "Marcus, even if we wanted to walk away from the money, we can't ignore the historical significance of this. The documents down here represent one of the most complete archives of Nazi criminal activity ever assembled." She was right. Beyond the financial implications, Heinrich's bunker contained evidence that could provide closure for thousands of families, help historians understand previously hidden aspects of the Holocaust, and potentially identify the rightful owners of stolen artwork and other valuables. "So what do we do?" Marcus asked. "We wait for Agent Martinez and her team," Sarah said. "We learn everything we can about the situation we're in. And then we make a decision based on complete information instead of fear." Marcus nodded, though part of him was already committed to seeing Heinrich's work through to completion. The historian in him understood the importance of what they'd discovered, and the new father in him was motivated by the financial security it could provide for their growing family. As dawn approached, they made themselves as comfortable as possible in the bunker's main room, taking turns resting while the other kept watch through the small periscope system Heinrich had installed to monitor the property's approaches. Neither of them slept well, but both were awake and alert when they heard the sound of vehicles approaching through the forest around 7 a.m. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. We're deep into this incredible story now, and I hope you're as captivated as I am by these unfolding events. The amount of effort that goes into researching, writing, and narrating these novel-length stories is immense. We're talking about creating content equivalent to a published book. But it's worth it to bring you stories that truly engage and transport you to another world. If you're enjoying this journey so far, please take a second to like this video and share it with friends who appreciate great storytelling. Your support means everything and helps us continue creating these detailed, epic narratives. We still have so much more to discover together, so let's see how this situation unfolds. Agent Rebecca Martinez was not what Marcus had expected. She was younger than her voice had suggested, probably early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence in her eyes that suggested she'd seen enough of the world's darkness to remain permanently skeptical of easy answers. She arrived with a team of 4 other agents, all of them dressed like they could pass for insurance adjusters or real estate developers. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," she said, shaking hands with both of them as they emerged from the bunker. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but Heinrich spoke of you often. He was very proud of your academic work, Mr. Brennan. You knew my uncle well?" "I worked with him for over a decade. He was one of the most dedicated people I've ever met, and one of the most careful. The fact that he chose you as his successor tells me everything I need to know about your character." Agent Martinez's team immediately began setting up sophisticated surveillance equipment around the property, while she and 2 other agents, introduced as Agent Collins and Agent Park, descended into the bunker to assess Heinrich's archive. "This is remarkable," Agent Collins said, examining the filing systems. "Heinrich maintained operational security that rivals anything we've seen in active government facilities." Agent Park was studying communications equipment. "Some of this gear is vintage, but it's all functional. He could monitor government frequencies, international communications, even satellite phone traffic from down here." "The question," Agent Martinez said to Marcus and Sarah, "is how much of this information you've processed and whether anyone else knows about your discovery." Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. They'd agreed to be completely honest with the federal agents, understanding that any deception could put them in greater danger. "We spent most of the night reading through the files," Sarah said. "We understand the general scope of the operation and the potential dangers involved." "And we haven't told anyone," Marcus added, "though my in-laws know we stayed here last night, and they'll expect us to contact them today." Agent Martinez nodded. "We'll handle your family communications. For the next few days, you'll need to maintain the appearance of normalcy while we assess the current threat level and prepare for the recovery operation." "Recovery operation?" Sarah asked. "You mean we're actually going to attempt to recover the Berlin Reserve?" "Mrs. Brennan, Heinrich spent 5 years documenting the location and legal framework for this recovery. The Chilean government has been cooperating with our investigation, and several international organizations are prepared to assist with proper distribution of recovered assets. This isn't the treasure hunt. It's the culmination of decades of legitimate law enforcement work." Agent Collins looked up from Heinrich's files. "The problem is that our targets know Heinrich is dead, and they've been monitoring activities related to his estate. The moment you accessed this bunker, you triggered surveillance systems that may have alerted them to renewed activity." "What kind of surveillance systems?" Marcus asked. Agent Park answered from his position at the communications console. "Heinrich was old-school paranoid, but he wasn't wrong to be. We've detected at least 3 different electronic monitoring systems focused on this property. Someone has been watching this place very carefully." Agent Martinez moved to examine a wall map that showed the broader region. Heinrich believed that the people protecting the Berlin Reserve had been preparing for this moment since his health began declining last year. They know about the final project, and they know that someone would eventually inherit his work. So they know about us, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. They know someone accessed the bunker. They don't necessarily know who, but they'll figure it out soon enough. Which is why we need to move quickly. Agent Martinez spread several documents across Heinrich's desk, revealing what appeared to be a detailed operational plan that Heinrich had developed in cooperation with the Department of Justice. The recovery operation involves 3 phases, she explained. First, we establish your legal standing as Heinrich's heir and representative. Second, we coordinate with Chilean authorities to access the vault locations. Third, we secure the assets and begin the process of identifying rightful owners and distributing recovered materials. Marcus studied the timeline. This says the entire operation should take less than 2 weeks. If everything goes according to plan, Agent Martinez confirmed. But Heinrich also prepared contingency plans for various complications, including active resistance from the families currently controlling the reserve locations. Sarah leaned forward, her nursing background making her focus on practical details. What kind of resistance? Are we talking about legal challenges or physical danger? Agent Collins answered grimly. According to Heinrich's intelligence, the families involved have used violence to protect their secrets before. 3 researchers investigating Nazi assets in South America have died under suspicious circumstances in the past decade. The weight of that information settled over the room like a physical presence. Marcus and Sarah were no longer just discussing historical mysteries and potential financial rewards. They were talking about people who had killed to protect secrets and might kill again. However, Agent Martinez continued, you won't be going to Chile alone. The recovery operation will involve agents from multiple countries, Chilean military support, and security measures that Heinrich helped design specifically for this scenario. Agent Park looked up from the communications equipment. We're getting encrypted traffic on several of Heinrich's monitoring frequencies. Someone is coordinating a response to last night's bunker access. Agent Martinez moved quickly to examine the intercepted communications. After a few minutes of listening to coded transmissions and consulting Heinrich's decryption notes, her expression became grim. They're moving faster than we expected, she said. We have perhaps 48 hours before they attempt to neutralize what they perceive as a threat to their operation. Neutralize? Sarah's voice was sharp with fear. Mrs. Brennan, these people have spent decades believing their secrets died with Heinrich. The discovery that his work has been inherited by someone else represents an existential threat to their security. They will attempt to eliminate that threat. Marcus felt his world tilting sideways again. Less than 24 hours ago, his biggest worry had been dealing with his mother-in-law's criticism about his career choices. Now he was apparently the target of international criminals who had been killing people for decades. What do we do? He asked. Agent Martinez was already coordinating with her team through secure communications. We accelerate the timeline. Instead of spending weeks preparing for the Chile operation, we leave tonight. Tonight? Sarah stood up abruptly. Agent Martinez, I'm pregnant. I can't just fly to South America on a moment's notice to dig up Nazi gold. Mrs. Brennan, with respect, staying here is far more dangerous than coming with us. The people we're dealing with don't leave witnesses, and they don't discriminate based on pregnancy status. Agent Collins had been monitoring additional communications traffic. We're seeing movement on at least 3 fronts, he reported. Private aircraft filed flight plans to Madison, Milwaukee, and Chicago. Ground teams are being positioned throughout Wisconsin. They're planning a coordinated operation to secure this location and eliminate any loose ends. How much time do we have? Agent Martinez asked. Based on travel times and coordination requirements, I'd estimate 18 to 20 hours before they're in position to act. Agent Martinez turned back to Marcus and Sarah. I'm not going to lie to you, this situation has become extremely dangerous very quickly. But Heinrich anticipated this possibility and prepared for it. If we move fast and follow his operational plan, we can complete the recovery operation and ensure your safety. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing the conflict in his eyes. Part of him was terrified by the dangers they were facing, but another part was clearly excited by the historical significance of what they were about to undertake. Marcus, she said quietly, what do you think Heinrich would want us to do? Marcus considered the question, thinking about everything they'd learned about his uncle's character and motivations. Heinrich had spent 70 years working to ensure that justice was served and that the victims of Nazi crimes received whatever closure and restitution was possible. He'd risked his own life repeatedly to make that happen. "I think he'd want us to finish what he started," Marcus said finally, "but only if we can do it safely." Agent Martinez nodded. Heinrich designed this operation with multiple safety protocols. You'll be protected by agents from 3 different countries, you'll have Chilean military support, and the recovery sites are in locations that can be easily secured and defended. And if something goes wrong? If something goes wrong, Heinrich prepared extraction protocols that will get you to safety immediately. Mrs. Brennan, your husband will never be more than 50 yards from armed federal agents, and you'll be in a secure location with medical support available at all times. Sarah looked around the bunker, taking in the evidence of Heinrich's decades-long dedication to justice. The walls were covered with photographs of Holocaust victims, survivors, and their families. People whose stolen property might finally be returned through the recovery operation. "How much good could we actually do?" she asked. Agent Martinez consulted Heinrich's financial projections. The Berlin Reserve is estimated to contain enough assets to provide significant compensation to approximately 15,000 families whose property was stolen during the war. It also includes artwork that belongs in museums and historical documents that could help resolve dozens of unsolved cases. The moral weight of the situation was overwhelming. Walking away would mean abandoning not just their own financial security, but also the hopes of thousands of people who deserve justice for crimes committed against their families decades ago. "What do we need to do?" Marcus asked. Agent Martinez smiled for the first time since arriving. "We need to pack quickly, secure this location, and get you both on a plane to Santiago. Heinrich's Chilean contacts are expecting us, and the recovery operation can begin as soon as we arrive." Over the next several hours, Marcus and Sarah packed for what they hoped would be a 2-week trip to South America, while Agent Martinez's team prepared the bunker for extended absence. Heinrich had designed the facility to operate autonomously for months, with automated systems that would continue monitoring communications and maintaining security even without human presence. "One more thing," Agent Martinez said as they prepared to leave for the airport. "Heinrich left personal messages for both of you. He wanted you to hear them before beginning the recovery operation." She led them to a section of the bunker they hadn't yet explored, where Heinrich had set up what appeared to be a personal office. On the desk was an old cassette player with 2 tapes labeled "For Marcus" and "For Sarah." Marcus played his tape first. Heinrich's voice, recorded perhaps weeks before his death, filled the small room. "Marcus, if you are hearing this, then my work is nearly complete, and you have chosen to help me finish it. I want you to know that I am proud of the man you have become, and honored that you will carry on what I could not complete alone. The path ahead is dangerous, but it is also righteous. The people whose property we seek to recover have waited 70 years for justice. You have the opportunity to provide that justice, and I believe you will do so with the integrity and compassion that have always defined your character. Remember that you are not just recovering gold and artwork. You are recovering hope for families who thought their losses would never be acknowledged. Be brave, be careful, and know that you carry my blessing and my love." Sarah's tape was shorter but equally moving. "Sarah, I know that my nephew has married a woman of great strength and wisdom. The choice you face is not easy, and I would understand if you chose safety over justice. But if you choose to help us complete this work, know that you will be protecting not just the victims of past crimes, but also future generations who deserve to inherit a world where justice is possible even decades after crimes are committed. Your child will grow up knowing that their parents chose to do what was right, even when it was dangerous. That is a legacy worth any risk." As Heinrich's voice faded away, Marcus and Sarah looked at each other through tears, understanding that they had just heard from a man who had dedicated his entire life to making amends for history's darkest chapter. "Are we really going to do this?" Sarah asked. Marcus took her hand. "Are we really going to walk away from it?" 6 hours later, they were on a private federal aircraft flying towards Santiago, Chile, with Agent Martinez's team and a future that would either make them heroes or get them killed. Neither of them could sleep during the flight, both too overwhelmed by the speed with which their lives had changed. Less than 48 hours ago, Marcus had been a community college professor worried about mortgage payments, and Sarah had been a nurse planning to surprise her husband with news of their pregnancy. Now they were federal witnesses flying to South America to recover $180 million in stolen Nazi assets while being hunted by international criminals who had been killing people to protect their secrets for decades. "Marcus," Sarah said as the plane crossed over the Caribbean, "promise me something." "What?" "Promise me that no matter what we find in Chile, no matter how much money is involved, we don't lose sight of why we're doing this." Marcus squeezed her hand. "For the families who never got justice." "And for our family," Sarah added. "For our baby who deserves parents who chose to do the right thing." Agent Martinez, overhearing their conversation from across the aisle, smiled. "Heinrich chose well," she said. "You're going to make him proud." As the plane continued south through the night, Marcus and Sarah Brennan tried to prepare themselves for what awaited them in Chile, and for the confrontation with history that would either vindicate Heinrich's life's work or destroy everything he had built. Santiago appeared through the aircraft windows as a sprawling metropolis nestled between the Andes Mountains and the Pacific coast, its modern skyline gleaming in the morning sun. Marcus had expected something more remote and primitive, but Chile's capital was clearly a sophisticated international city, with the infrastructure to support complex operations like the one they were about to undertake. Agent Martinez had used the flight time to brief them on their Chilean contacts and the logistical challenges they would face. The Berlin Reserve was not stored in a single location, but distributed across 4 separate vault sites in the mountains east of Santiago, each controlled by a different family and each requiring separate legal and practical approaches for access. "The Chilean government has been extremely cooperative," Agent Martinez explained as they prepared to land. "But they've also been very careful to respect property rights and international law. We can't just raid these locations. We have to prove legal standing and provide evidence of criminal activity." Their first meeting was scheduled with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a Chilean historian who had been working with Heinrich for 3 years to document the presence of Nazi war criminals in her country. Dr. Vasquez met them at the airport with a small convoy of official vehicles and enough security to suggest that the Chilean government was taking the operation very seriously. "Mr. Brennan," Dr. Vasquez said, shaking Marcus's hand warmly, "Heinrich spoke of you often in our communications. He was very excited about your academic work on German-American communities during the war period." Dr. Vasquez was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of intense focus that Marcus recognized in his most dedicated academic colleagues. She had spent decades researching the post-war Nazi diaspora in South America, and her work had been instrumental in identifying several war criminals who had been living quietly in Chile under assumed identities. "Dr. Vasquez," Marcus said, "I have to admit I'm feeling somewhat overwhelmed by all of this. Yesterday I was a community college professor, and today I'm apparently key to recovering $180 million in stolen assets." "Mr. Brennan, you are not just key to recovering assets. You are key to providing justice for thousands of families whose property was stolen and whose relatives were murdered. The money is important, but the historical significance of this recovery cannot be overstated." As their convoy wound through Santiago's streets toward the hotel where they would be staying, Dr. Vasquez explained the current status of the recovery operation. The Chilean courts had issued preliminary authorization for accessing the vault sites, but only if Marcus could prove his legal standing as Heinrich's heir and demonstrate legitimate authority to act on behalf of the various governments and organizations seeking restitution. The families controlling these sites have been preparing legal challenges for months," Dr. Vasquez said. "They claim that Heinrich's research was based on fabricated evidence and that any recovered assets were legally acquired by their ancestors." "Can they prove that?" Sarah asked. "They have retained very expensive lawyers and have been attempting to influence political opinion for several years. But Heinrich's documentation is extremely thorough, and our government is committed to seeing justice done." Their hotel was a modern business establishment in Santiago's financial district, chosen for its security capabilities and proximity to the government offices where much of their legal work would be conducted. Agent Martinez's team had taken over an entire floor, establishing secure communications with Washington and coordinating with Chilean law enforcement agencies. "The timeline has accelerated even more since we left Wisconsin," Agent Martinez informed them as they settled into their suite. Our intelligence suggests that the hostile parties we identified are now actively working to disrupt the recovery operation. What kind of disruption? Marcus asked. Agent Collins looked up from a bank of communication equipment he'd been setting up. Legal challenges, political pressure, and at least 2 attempts to bribe Chilean officials. They're throwing everything they have at preventing us from accessing those vault sites. But they haven't resorted to violence yet, Agent Park added, which suggests they still believe they can stop us through legal and political means. Sarah looked out the hotel window at the bustling city below. What happens if they can't stop us legally? Agent Martinez's expression became grim. Then we move to Heinrich's contingency plans for active resistance. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. Their first day in Santiago was spent in meetings with Chilean government officials, establishing Marcus's legal credentials and reviewing the evidence Heinrich had compiled over decades of investigation. The documentation was overwhelming. Thousands of pages of research, photographs, financial records, and witness testimonies that painted a clear picture of systematic theft and murder committed by Nazi officials who had fled to South America after Germany's defeat. But the most compelling evidence came from Heinrich himself. Dr. Vasquez had brought with her a collection of video recordings Heinrich had made over the past 5 years, documenting his investigation and explaining his findings for posterity. Heinrich wanted to ensure that his work would be understood and validated even if he didn't live to see its completion, Dr. Vasquez explained as she set up the video equipment in their hotel suite. The first recording showed Heinrich in his bunker office, surrounded by the files and maps that Marcus and Sarah had discovered just 2 days earlier. But this Heinrich was more animated and passionate than either of them had expected, clearly energized by the prospect of finally completing his life's work. If you are watching this, Heinrich said on the recording, then the final project is moving forward, and justice may finally be served for crimes that have been hidden for 7 decades. I want you to understand that what we are recovering is not simply gold and artwork. We are recovering the hopes and dreams that were stolen from innocent people who trusted their governments to protect them. Heinrich went on to explain the origins of the Berlin Reserve, describing how high-ranking Nazi officials had systematically looted not just government treasuries but also private collections, religious artifacts, and even wedding rings and family heirlooms taken from Holocaust victims. The reserve was assembled as insurance, Heinrich continued. These men knew that Germany would lose the war, and they wanted to ensure their own survival and comfort in exile. They cared nothing for the suffering they had caused or the lives they had destroyed. They thought only of preserving their wealth and their freedom. The second recording was more recent, made apparently just weeks before Heinrich's death. In this video, he looked frailer but no less determined. The families currently controlling the reserve have built legitimate lives on foundations of theft and murder, he said. Their children and grandchildren may be innocent of the original crimes, but they have benefited from those crimes and have actively worked to prevent justice from being served. They have bribed officials, intimidated witnesses, and even committed murder to protect their secrets. Heinrich's voice grew stronger as he continued. But justice delayed is not justice denied. The victims of these crimes deserve to have their property returned to their families. The world deserves to know the truth about how Nazi criminals escaped punishment and built new lives in South America. And history deserves to be corrected. The final recording was personal, clearly intended specifically for Marcus and Sarah. Marcus and Sarah, Heinrich said, looking directly into the camera, I know that what I am asking you to do is dangerous and difficult. I know that you did not choose to become involved in this situation. But sometimes history chooses us rather than the other way around. You have the opportunity to complete work that began in the concentration camps and ghettos of Nazi-occupied Europe. You have the opportunity to speak for victims who can no longer speak for themselves. That is a sacred responsibility, but it is also a tremendous honor. When the recordings ended, the room was silent, except for the sound of traffic from the street below. Marcus and Sarah sat holding hands, both overwhelmed by the weight of what they had inherited. Dr. Vasquez, Sarah said finally, what happens to the families who are currently controlling these sites? I mean, assuming some of them are innocent descendants who didn't know about their ancestors' crimes? That is one of the most difficult aspects of this recovery, Dr. Vasquez replied. Chilean law provides for compensation in cases where current property owners can demonstrate good faith possession of disputed assets. But in cases where families have actively worked to conceal criminal origins of their wealth, the law is less sympathetic. Agent Martinez added, Our investigation has shown that at least 2 of the 4 families involved have been actively intimidating researchers and witnesses for decades. They're not innocent bystanders. They're active participants in ongoing criminal conspiracy. But the other 2 families? Marcus asked. Dr. Vasquez consulted her files. More complicated. The Schneider family appears to have genuinely believed their patriarch was a legitimate businessman who fled Germany for political reasons. The Richter family. They may have suspected the truth, but never acted on their suspicions. Heinrich believed, Agent Martinez said, that justice required compassion as well as accountability. His recovery plan includes provisions for protecting innocent family members while still ensuring that stolen assets are returned to their rightful owners. The next morning brought their first direct contact with the families controlling the vault sites. Dr. Vasquez had arranged meetings with representatives from each family, hoping to negotiate voluntary cooperation with the recovery operation. The first meeting, with lawyers representing the Wagner family, was hostile from the moment they walked into the conference room. The family's lead attorney, a sharp-dressed woman named Isabella Moreno, immediately went on the offensive. "Mr. Brennan," she said without preamble, "my clients consider your claims to be fabricated accusations designed to steal property that has been legally owned by the Wagner family for more than 70 years. "Ms. Moreno," Marcus replied, trying to maintain his composure, "we have extensive documentation that the original Heinrich Wagner was a Nazi SS officer who fled Germany with stolen assets. We're not trying to steal anything. We're trying to return stolen property to its rightful owners." "Documentation that cannot be authenticated," Ms. Moreno shot back. "Documentation provided by a man who had clear financial motivations for fabricating evidence against my clients." Agent Martinez leaned forward. "Ms. Moreno, perhaps you should review Heinrich Brennan's financial records before making accusations about his motivations. He spent his own money for decades funding this investigation, and he donated every finder's fee he received to Holocaust survivor organizations." The meeting continued in the same adversarial tone for 2 hours, with the Wagner family's representatives denying every piece of evidence and threatening extensive legal action if the recovery operation proceeded. By the time they left the conference room, it was clear that the Wagner family would fight the recovery with every resource at their disposal. The meeting with the Schneider family was completely different. Maria Schneider, a woman in her 70s who had inherited her father's estate, arrived with a single lawyer and a box of documents she had been preparing for years. "Mr. Brennan," she said, "I have been waiting for someone like you to contact me. I have suspected for decades that my father's story about his past was not complete, and I have been researching on my own to understand the truth." Maria Schneider had spent 15 years quietly investigating her father's background, discovering evidence that suggested he had indeed been involved in Nazi activities before fleeing to Chile. But unlike the Wagner family, she had not tried to cover up or deny the evidence. "If my father committed crime," she said, "then justice must be served, even if it is difficult for my family. But I want to ensure that the process is fair, and that any recovered assets actually reach the people who deserve them." The meeting with Maria Schneider gave Marcus and Sarah hope that not all of the recovery operation would involve adversarial proceedings. But that hope was shattered when Agent Martinez received an urgent communication from Washington during their lunch break. "We have a problem," Agent Martinez announced as she rejoined them at the hotel restaurant. "Intelligence indicates that hostile parties are planning to take direct action to stop the recovery operation." "What kind of direct action?" Sarah asked. Agent Collins answered, "We've intercepted communications suggesting a plan to eliminate key witnesses and destroy evidence before the vault access operations can begin." Marcus felt his blood turn cold. "Key witnesses meaning us?" "Key witnesses, meaning you, Dr. Vasquez, and several Chilean officials who have been supporting the recovery operation," Agent Martinez confirmed. The restaurant suddenly felt exposed and dangerous, with too many windows and too many strangers at nearby tables. Marcus found himself looking around nervously, wondering if any of the other diners might be potential threats. "How credible is this intelligence?" Dr. Vasquez asked. Agent Park consulted his secure communications device. "Very credible. We've confirmed movement of known associates of the families involved, and we've detected preparations for what appears to be a coordinated operation planned for tonight." Sarah gripped Marcus's hand under the table. "Agent Martinez, what are our options?" "We accelerate the timeline again. Instead of spending several days on legal proceedings, we move directly to accessing the vault sites today. The Chilean military is prepared to provide security, and our legal authorizations are sufficient to proceed. Today, Marcus felt overwhelmed by how quickly events were moving. But we haven't finished reviewing all the evidence, and we haven't completed negotiations with the families. Mr. Brennan, Dr. Vasquez said gently, Heinrich spent 5 years preparing for this moment. The evidence has been reviewed. The legal framework is in place. Mr. Brennan, Dr. Vasquez said gently, Heinrich spent 5 years preparing for this moment. The evidence has been reviewed. The legal framework is in place, and the window for safe recovery is closing rapidly. Agent Martinez was already coordinating with her team through secure communications. We move in 2 hours. The first vault site is 40 minutes from here, and we have Chilean military escorts standing by. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing the fear and excitement warring in his eyes. Marcus, are you ready for this? Before he could answer, Agent Collins appeared at their table with urgent news. We've got a bigger problem. The hostile parties aren't just planning to stop us. They're planning to recover the assets themselves. We've intercepted communications indicating they have inside information about the vault locations and access procedures. Inside information? Dr. Vasquez looked alarmed. That's impossible. Only 5 people knew the complete details of Heinrich's final research. Agent Martinez's expression became grim. And now we know at least one of them has been compromised. The implication hit everyone at the table simultaneously. Someone in their group, or someone in the Chilean government, had been feeding information to the families controlling the Berlin Reserve. The recovery operation had been compromised from the beginning. Dr. Vasquez, Agent Martinez said carefully, I need you to think very carefully about who has had access to Heinrich's research files over the past few months. Dr. Vasquez's face went pale as she considered the possibilities. There were only a few people. My research assistant Carlos, the government liaison Miguel Santos, and… She stopped, her eyes widening with realization. Who else? Agent Martinez pressed. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Professor Alejandro Restrepo from the University of Chile. He was helping me authenticate some of Heinrich's documents. But Alejandro has been a colleague for 20 years. He wouldn't. Agent Park interrupted from his monitoring station. Ma'am, we're picking up encrypted communications that suggest the hostile operation will begin in approximately 4 hours. They're planning to access the vault sites before we can get there. Agent Martinez made a quick decision. Change of plans. We skipped the remaining family meetings and moved directly to the most accessible vault site. If we can secure even one cache of the reserve, we can build legal momentum for accessing the others. The next hour was a whirlwind of preparation. Marcus and Sarah were fitted with bulletproof vests and communications equipment, briefed on emergency procedures, and introduced to the Chilean military officers who would be providing security for the operation. The weight of body armor made the danger feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. Mrs. Brennan, Agent Martinez said as they prepared to leave the hotel. Are you certain you want to come with us? We can keep you safe here while your husband handles the vault access. Sarah adjusted her vest, thinking of Heinrich's final message about sacred responsibility. Agent Martinez. Those stolen assets include jewelry and personal items taken from women and children. If we're going to speak for victims who can't speak for themselves, then I need to be there. The convoy of armored vehicles wound through Santiago's traffic and then climbed into the Andes Mountains on roads that became increasingly remote and treacherous. Marcus watched the landscape change from urban sprawl to agricultural valleys to rocky mountain terrain, wondering if they were driving toward vindication or disaster. The first site is hidden in what appears to be a private mining operation, Dr. Vasquez explained, consulting Heinrich's detailed maps. The Richter family has been using it as a legitimate business for decades, but Heinrich's research indicates the original tunnels were excavated specifically to hide the stolen assets. Agent Martinez was monitoring communications from multiple sources. We're getting reports of unusual activity at all 4 vault sites. It looks like our timeline estimate was optimistic. The hostile operation may already be underway. As their convoy crested a ridge and began descending toward the valley where the Richter mining operation was located, Agent Collins spotted something that made him grab his binoculars. Movement on the access road, he reported. Looks like a convoy of civilian vehicles, but they're maintaining military-style spacing and communication procedures. Agent Martinez studied the scene through her own field glasses. That's not a civilian operation. Someone else is already here. The Richter mining facility looked legitimate enough from a distance. Industrial buildings, processing equipment, and the scarred landscape typical of extractive operations. But Heinrich's research had identified the specific tunnel complex where the stolen assets were hidden, and his maps showed access points that weren't visible from the main facility. There, Marcus said, pointing to a cluster of buildings near the base of a rocky outcropping. According to Heinrich's notes, that's where the real entrance is located. Their convoy stopped at a tactical distance from the facility, and Agent Martinez began coordinating with the Chilean military commander who had been assigned to support the operation. Colonel Ramirez was a career officer who had been briefed on the historical significance of the recovery mission and was clearly taking it seriously. "Colonel," Agent Martinez said, "what's your assessment of the situation?" "The facility appears to be occupied by persons unknown," Colonel Ramirez replied in accented but precise English. "We count at least 12 vehicles and an estimated 30 to 40 individuals. They arrived approximately 2 hours ago and have been setting up what appears to be a major excavation operation." Marcus studied the scene through binoculars, seeing heavy equipment being moved into position and teams of people working with obvious urgency around the buildings Heinrich had identified. "They're not just trying to stop us from recovering the assets, they're trying to recover them first." Sarah, watching the activity below, made an observation that changed everyone's perspective on the situation. "Look at how organized they are. This isn't a desperate attempt to hide evidence. This looks like a professional operation that's been planned for a long time." Agent Martinez lowered her binoculars slowly. "They've been planning this recovery operation in parallel with ours. They've been waiting for Heinrich to complete his research, and then they've been planning to steal it." The realization was staggering. The families controlling the Berlin Reserve hadn't been trying to keep it hidden. They'd been waiting for Heinrich to do the work of locating and documenting it so they could recover it themselves while eliminating any witnesses to their ancestors' crimes. "Agent Martinez," Marcus said, "if they succeed in recovering those assets, they'll have $180 million to fund lawyers, bribes, and whatever else it takes to make this entire investigation disappear." "Not if we stop them first," Colonel Ramirez interjected. "My orders are to support the legitimate recovery operation and to prevent criminal activity. If these persons are attempting to steal internationally protected assets, they are criminals under Chilean law." What followed was a carefully coordinated military operation that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Chilean special forces moved into position around the facility, while Agent Martinez's team prepared for the delicate task of documenting and securing whatever assets they found. The confrontation, when it came, was anticlimactic. The unauthorized excavation team, faced with superior numbers and military-grade equipment, surrendered without violence. But the real drama began when Marcus and Sarah finally descended into the tunnel complex that Heinrich had spent 5 years documenting. The Berlin Reserve was everything Heinrich had claimed and more. Room after room of carefully stored gold bars, jewelry, artwork, and documents. All of it meticulously cataloged and preserved by people who had clearly been maintaining it for decades. The scope of the theft it represented was overwhelming, but so was the potential for justice it contained. "Marcus," Sarah whispered as they walked through chambers filled with stolen treasures, "look at this." She had found a display case containing hundreds of items of personal jewelry, wedding rings, family heirlooms, religious artifacts that had clearly been taken from individual victims rather than government treasuries. Each piece was tagged with information that would allow it to be traced back to its original owners. "Heinrich was right," Marcus said, his voice filled with emotion. "This isn't just about money. This is about giving families back pieces of their history that they thought were lost forever." Dr. Vasquez was examining documents in an adjoining chamber, her academic excitement evident despite the grim circumstances. "Mr. Brennan, these records document the complete operations of the theft network. We have shipping manifests, financial records, even correspondence between the Nazi officials who organized the reserve. This is the most complete archive of systematic wartime theft ever discovered." Agent Martinez was coordinating the massive task of cataloging and securing the recovered assets. According to Heinrich's projections, this single site contains assets worth approximately $45 million. But the historical and evidential value is incalculable. Over the next 3 days, working with Chilean authorities and international experts, they recovered assets from all 4 vault sites. The total value exceeded even Heinrich's estimates, nearly $200 million in gold, jewelry, artwork, and other valuables, plus archives that would revolutionize historical understanding of Nazi criminal networks in South America. But the most meaningful moment came when they discovered Heinrich's final surprise. Hidden in the deepest chamber of the last vault was a small room that wasn't marked on any of his maps. Inside, they found a single chair facing a wall covered with photographs, thousands of images of Holocaust victims, survivors, and their families. In the center of the display was a letter addressed to Marcus. "My dear nephew," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then justice has finally been served for crimes that I have spent my lifetime trying to address. But I want you to remember that the money and gold we have recovered are not the true treasure. The true treasure is in these faces, people who suffered unimaginable losses but whose memory will now be honored through the return of what was taken from them. You and Sarah are not just recovering assets. You are recovering dignity, memory, and hope. Use this inheritance wisely, not just for your own family, but for the families represented in these photographs. They are your inheritance too." 6 months later, Marcus and Sarah Brennan stood in the delivery room of Chicago Memorial Hospital, holding their newborn daughter, Elena, named after Dr. Vasquez, who had become a close friend and collaborator. The recovery operation had been completed successfully, with assets distributed to museums, Holocaust survivor organizations, and families around the world who had proven their connection to stolen property. Marcus and Sarah's share, after legal fees and distribution costs, was still substantial enough to change their lives completely. Marcus had taken a leave of absence from teaching to establish the Heinrich Brennan Foundation for Historical Justice, working with international organizations to continue the work of tracking down and recovering stolen wartime assets. Sarah had returned to nursing but was also studying law, planning to specialize in international restitution cases. "She's going to grow up in a world where justice is possible," Sarah said, looking down at their daughter, "even 70 years later." Marcus nodded, thinking of Heinrich's words about history choosing them rather than the other way around. "And she's going to know that her parents chose to do the right thing, even when it was dangerous." Agent Martinez had stayed in touch, updating them on the continuing investigation into the families who had been controlling the vault sites. 3 individuals had been charged with conspiracy to commit theft of internationally protected assets. The Wagner family had fled Chile and were fighting extradition from Switzerland, but Maria Schneider had cooperated fully with the investigation and had been allowed to keep property that could be proven to have legitimate origins. Dr. Vasquez had been appointed to head Chile's new Historical Justice Commission, dedicated to investigating other cases of wartime criminals who had found refuge in South America. Her first case was already showing promising leads to another cache of stolen assets hidden in Argentina. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the responses from families around the world who had received recovered items that had belonged to their ancestors. Letters, photographs, and videos poured in from people who had never expected to see their grandparents' wedding rings or their family's religious artifacts again. "Heinrich was right," Marcus said as they prepared to take Elena home. "We weren't just recovering gold and artwork, we were recovering hope." As Marcus and Sarah drove through Chicago's streets toward their new home, purchased with a fraction of their inheritance from the recovery operation, they passed a billboard advertising the Heinrich Brennan Memorial Exhibition at the Chicago History Museum. The exhibition, which had opened to record crowds, told the complete story of Nazi criminal networks in the Americas and displayed some of the recovered artwork that had been donated to public institutions. "Look," Sarah said, pointing to the billboard, "your uncle's name is going to be remembered for the right reasons now." Marcus smiled, thinking of the secret bunker where this incredible journey had begun. The farmhouse in Wisconsin had been donated to the University of Wisconsin as a research center, with the bunker preserved as a memorial to Heinrich's life work and as a training facility for future historical investigators. The Heinrich Brennan story had become an international sensation, inspiring books, documentaries, and academic studies. But for Marcus and Sarah, the most important outcome was much simpler. They had chosen to honor the past by creating a better future for their daughter and for the thousands of families whose stolen property had finally been returned. In the end, Heinrich's greatest inheritance wasn't the $200 million in recovered assets, It was the proof that justice, however delayed, was still possible, and that sometimes ordinary people could choose to do extraordinary things when history called upon them to act. As they pulled into their driveway, Elena sleeping peacefully in her car seat, Marcus and Sarah knew that they had not only inherited a fortune, they had inherited a legacy of courage, integrity, and hope that would guide their family for generations to come. And that concludes our incredible journey through the inheritance. A story that took us from a flooded basement in Wisconsin to secret Nazi gold caches in the Chilean mountains, from academic obscurity to international headlines, and from financial worry to a legacy that will impact thousands of lives for generations. Thank you so much for staying with us through this epic 50,000-word adventure. Creating these detailed, novel-length stories requires tremendous research, writing, and production effort. But it's absolutely worth it when we can share stories that truly captivate and inspire. If you've enjoyed this journey as much as I have, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd show your support in a few ways. First, please hit that like button. It really helps us know that you value this type of in-depth storytelling, and it helps other people discover these epic narratives. Second, if you know someone who loves historical mysteries, family secrets, or just incredible storytelling, please share this video with them. Word-of-mouth recommendations from viewers like you are the best way for us to reach people who would truly appreciate these detailed stories. Third, please subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We're constantly working on new epic tales, from historical mysteries like this one, to science fiction adventures, family sagas, and stories that explore the most fascinating aspects of human nature and history. Your support means everything to us, and makes it possible for us to continue investing the time and research necessary to bring you these book-length stories that you can't find anywhere else. We're already working on our next epic tale, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. In the comments below, let us know what you thought of Marcus and Sarah's incredible journey. Did Heinrich make the right choice in trusting his nephew with such a dangerous inheritance? What would you have done in their situation? And what type of story would you like to see us tackle next? Thank you again for joining us on this remarkable adventure. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary moments. And you never know what secrets might be hidden beneath the surface of your own family history. See you in the next epic tale.